Welcome back to Diverse, where we're getting real testimonials from people working to move the neurodiversity movement forward. This week we are joined by David H., a writing student through CUNY and advocate for the Neurodiversity Network of West New York, a neurodiversity activism group based in Buffalo. Let's join him in a discussion about the question of diagnosis, the meaning of advocacy, and the implications of a cure. All right, today we are joined by David H., a passionate self-advocate and neurodivergent writing student. He's here to represent the Neurodiversity Network of West New York, a neurodiversity activism group which aims to, and I quote here, empower and support individuals by advocating for the recognition and acceptance of the neurodiversity paradigm. That's just fantastic. So, first thing I want to know, how did you get involved with the Neurodiversity Network and neurodiversity activism in general?
Well, I mean, there's no shortage of volunteer opportunities. We have people from, neurodivergent persons from all walks of life, all sorts of backgrounds, reach out to us frequently. I would say, it's volunteering, seeing what, an organization is about, seeing how their values align with yours, where I would say, I've come to learn that, advocacy and social justice comes in a lot of varieties. It's one of those things where I feel like, it's easy. I don't know too many people that say, oh no, I vehemently am against social justice. It's one of those, it's like saying, I don't like the idea of anti-racism, like no one would really say that, but when push comes to shove, and actions are needed, there's things that are difficult and are not convenient, but they just need to be done in order to advance, the cause of disabled and neurodivergent people, which don't always co-occur. There are plenty of neurodivergent people, I think, that don't even identify as being disabled, but there's certainly, are a good many in which, they might be identifying both ways. But I guess, it's an area that I feel passionately about. So I am willing to take risks. That's one of the, the hallmarks, right, of we ADHDers is we might, take risks sometimes that can be hazardous to our health, but also, we push the envelope. But I would say just really, it's important. The way I got a start with the Neurodiversity Network is when I was running into a lot of issues at the campus I'm at, in terms of, having accommodations, and I reached out to the network. Adriana was, getting back to me, I got the sense very quickly, I was onto something, that I was finding, my neuro tribe, so to speak. And after doing some events with her, that really confirmed it. So I think it's just, see how the values align, recognizing that not all advocacy and social justice means the same thing to everyone, and seeing how that really aligns with what you're interested in doing.
So to clarify for our listeners back home, Adriana, correct me if I'm wrong, founded the Neurodiversity Network?
Yeah. Her son is multiply neurodivergent. So he has ADHD and autism, and still has a bit of untapped, verbal abilities. So he cannot always express himself in the way that he would like to, and I imagine that's got to be incredibly frustrating, and
Mm,
it would make me pretty damn angry too.
absolutely.
And so, you know, but he's just a beautiful boy, and you know, he's got so much to give, and yeah. So I think for Adriana, someone in social work, she just saw, you know, resources in the area, but very much kind of spread out and not really things integrated in any sort of way that seemed very logical and coherent. So I think, you know, when she got it going, she just, you know, she's a very devoted mother. You know, her son comes first, and she'll do anything for him, and I think she just wanted to, you know, she's the kind of person that if she doesn't know something, you know, rather than going for the low hanging fruit, I mean, she's the sort that's going to really invest the time and energy and figure out, you know, what is the most productive avenues in this area. And so she, yeah, started really just initially just wanting to help her son and just understand things better herself.
That's wonderful. I actually work in linguistic development with autistic children, so not being able to say things is very familiar to me and that frustration. So
Yeah,
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 I totally can respect her a lot on that front. So
yeah.
yeah, this seems like a really powerful organization. I saw on the website that one of your core tenets is rejecting neuronormativity. So can you tell
Mhm.
me a little bit about what that word, in your words, sort of means and why we should be rejecting it?
Yeah, you know, in a previous life, I was a psychological scientist, and you know, the way I learned about psychology, the nervous system, cognitive, social, emotional abilities, you know, is was very much like, you know, your typical student of psychology does. I mean, I think the useful example is if, you know, for any of your listeners who know anything about statistics, I mean, if you take a basic statistics course, you know, one of the first things you learn, right, is when you start talking about probabilities and distributions of scores, you know, you think of the so-called bell curve, right? And so you learn that, you know, 66.6%, you know, if you have that nice pretty bell curve, you know, for something say like I'm saying um kind of the traditional concept of intelligence because of course we we being, I mean, not only among folks in the neurodiversity field, but I think even among a lot of scientists within the field of psychology, I mean, I think we're well beyond the point where we just strictly restrict our thinking to intelligence as being, you know, this very cold cognitive, you know, sort of processes. But if we take the traditional concept of intelligence, you know, how um, you know, I have many qualms with the idea of intelligence, but if just say for the sake of discussion, if we think of it as, you know, the speed with which we process information, not, I mean, they're right from the beginning is one of my qualms because I don't know that I necessarily agree that speed of processing, but let's assume it is. Let's assume that's how we view
Sure.
intelligence.
For this
I think they
example, intelligence is the speed
yeah,
of processing. Sure.
speed of processing, how, you know, quickly retrieving memories, whatever.
Yeah.
And so if we look at how all of, you know, folks scores on these tests stack up, we're going to see a lot of them kind of in that middle, right? And then we're going to notice, you know, things kind of trailing off on the outskirts. And you know, I remember learning, for example, like in the first time I took psychology. I mean, the way you think of that, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? You learn, you know, some people might have pretty extraordinary cognitive abilities in a very good way. Like, you know, I don't really like the term genius because I think it celebrates the individual and ignores everyone who has supported them along the way. But, very brilliant, very sharp folks. But then we come to see folks kind of at the bottom of that curve as being lacking or defective. And for me, neuronormativity, if we just think of our nervous systems, right? Like no two nervous systems are going to be precisely the same. Your breakdown of your neurotransmitters, your brain chemicals, your breakdown of serotonin, norepinephrine, your breakdown of hormones, stress hormones, your genetic profile. There's no person on this planet that to the T is going to have a nervous system precisely like yours. But you're kind of taught, when you learn about psychology, that, there's what kind of stacks up in the middle and is, quote, typical. And then everything beyond that is either really exceptional or it's abnormal and it's defective. And I suppose I understand how that came to be, but I think that when you basically designate people who are in a certain part of a distribution as being defective, disordered, diseased, you really have to think about what that does to those people. I mean, how would you feel? You know, I've seen many, healthcare providers, and I can tell you there's nothing more annoying and a shot to my self-esteem when a doc is referring to my comorbidities. I mean, who wants to think about their personhood in terms of, I mean, first of all, I get they need their jargon, but I mean, no patient wants to hear the word comorbidity. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's the concept of normal is a construction. We all are very different. Some of us might, fall a bit in that middle to what we think of as typical. But I think if we're genuinely invested in celebrating, all of the wonderful differences in the human experience, I would just encourage us to think more critically and compassionately about, people who fall in different parts of that distribution in terms of how they function.
Mm. Absolutely. So that kind of brings us pretty cleanly into what is, I think, really a pretty controversial topic, if you'd allow me to go there. In my research, I've seen a lot of discussion and controversy around the concept of a cure for autism. Have you come across this concept before, and kind of what is your response to that ideology?
Um, so let's say for the sake of discussion that we could cure autism. I don't know that I would really want to. And I don't say that in any sort of diminishing way to the families and the people who live with autism and the struggles. I I mean, I'm neurodivergent. I'm not autistic, but I know what it's like to have very real, debilitating things. But I mean, if we could cure autism, one, I don't know that I'm really convinced that we could, but I think a lot of that stems, from a very ableist, you know, neuronormative way of thinking is that the question really there is this built-in assumption that there's something wrong with being autistic. And in my view, there is nothing wrong with being autistic. I mean, can it present just really significant challenges and stress and just a lot of difficulties in life? Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think many folks who know even the slightest bit about autism can recognize that. But I think it comes from this idea that there's this ideal nervous system, there's this ideal way to function, and yeah, you see that. I mean, you see people in some ways I think I can understand it. I mean, hearing, a lot of the struggles Adriana, I mean, I have my son isn't old enough to be diagnosed with ADHD yet. But I can tell you right now, I mean, my
Yeah.
background wasn't in clinical psychology, but I mean, you don't have to be a clinical psychologist to look at me, look at my son and go, "Oh yeah, yeah."
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like, I mean, it's just clear as day, and that he's gonna have his own challenges, but I don't know. No, let me reword that. I know, say, even if there was a cure for ADHD, which I don't think there ever will be, I would not want to cure my son of ADHD. I mean, do I want him to learn how to be better organized? Because that's something a lot of us struggle with. Do I want him to learn how to control his impulsivity and channel it a little bit better? Yeah, of course. I mean, but he that is who he is, and that is who I am. And I think that we're kind of taught, that I no longer believe really in the idea of overcoming. Again, I think that's very much a sort of ableist way of thinking. I'm never going to overcome um, living with ADHD and OCD. It's not ever going to happen, but I every day I try to manage it better. And I think to your question though, I think one of the things also that can result from, this sort of wishful thinking too is, there's just a lot of room in the desperation maybe some parents might have who are not terribly informed, is you see a lot of misinformation like, vaccines cause autism, which
Yes.
I mean, based on the available scientific literature, I mean, there's no evidence
Yes, for
to,
our listeners at home, that paper was famously debunked years ago. So if anybody
yeah,
listening still
Andrew,
believes that, I have bad news.
yeah, yeah, no, I mean that it was a falsified study by
Yeah.
Wakefield, I don't know, that was something like over, I think it's going on something like 30 years ago.
Mm.
And there never really was a basis for it. But I get it, right? Like if you hearing, already experiencing the struggles of having a neurodivergent son, seeing, what Adriana, just the amount of just unrelenting stress that she has trying to raise a neurodivergent youngster, like there's a part of you that can see why people would be tempted, not only just from the ableist framework, but also just because it's really, fracking. That's my Battlestar Galactica reference, by the way. It's really fracking difficult, right? Raising neurodivergent youngsters. So you get why people are, grasping at things like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think this kind of takes us into a good segue of, how are we dealing with these kids as opposed to how we should be dealing with these kids. And I don't mean to say kids to be reductive, people, because of course it's not just children who struggle with these things.
Mhm.
I saw on your website, I saw the phrase trauma informed care several times. So I haven't heard that before. Can you kind of explain what this concept means in a little more detail?
Yeah, I mean, admittedly, it's an area that um, I think I mean, there's always room for improvement. There's always new different ways of thinking to try to incorporate with your current thinking. I mean, admittedly, I know a little bit about it. I think Adriana, as a social worker, she certainly, I think has a much, you know, higher level of expertise. But if you think about, neurodivergent people, which I mean, I would just simply define as really just the recognition of the infinite possibilities of human nervous system functioning. And if there's, a wide variety of possibilities of the human nervous system, there's a good many ways we can see all sorts of neurocognitive abilities But if you think about people who have, historically been, that proverbial square peg being, just really jammed into the round hole, um, I think you can imagine many instances, and in particularly, folks that might fly a bit under the radar. I mean, I always kind of knew that I had ADHD, and I could very much see that OCD ran in my family. I mean, my mother, I mean, she just would destroy kitchen sink levers. I mean, it was like every 4 months, my stepdad was putting a new one on. Every 6 to 8 months, he was putting a new handle on the sliding glass door. I mean, my sister, her home looks like something out of a magazine. I mean,
Mm.
she is your stereotypical neat freak OCDer, and I'm a symmetry order ACDer. I'm not a neat freak, but I mean, if you see my bookshelves, which with the exception of that one, I do need to get to that one. I mean, I can organize books and catalog them for hours because that's just how the OCD I live with kind of comes to be. But you can imagine when you have people who, particularly if they're not, someone like me who kind of always suspected it but was not formally diagnosed until later in life. I'm nearly 41. I didn't have my first neuropsychological assessment until I was, let's see, 34. And so, I mean, you kind of know something's there, but you can't quite pinpoint it. And so you can imagine how, especially if you're not fully aware of it, and people maybe in your support system, they're suspecting, but they're not fully aware of it either. You can imagine how there's all sorts of situations where you're subscribing to this notion that whatever you're struggling with, you're going to overcome it, and you're putting yourself in situations in a world that really didn't have you in mind to begin with when the systems were put into place. And so, I mean, you can imagine, and I think there's a decent amount of research to bear it out, but I mean, people who are neurodivergent, I mean, they tend to, have pretty high rates of traumatic experiences relative to people who are, quote, have typically developed nervous systems. And so I think, one of the questions is when you have people like, for example, with me, I was, told, even though I'm not autistic, I mean, I still don't really like making eye contact with people. I remember being shouted at as a child to make eye contact.
Mhm.
And that was very disturbing for me, or having my face grabbed. And so, I think the question we should be asking ourselves is if historically people who are neurologically different, who present very different sort of ways of thinking and behaviors, if they haven't been treated particularly well and they have accumulated a lot of trauma in their lives, I think the question, and it's a fair one we should be asking ourselves, is what can we do to minimize that further? And there's this idea of affirming, right? And so, I have right now a medical provider who is like the coolest provider ever. When I was in the city recently, not too far from you, because I have to go in once a year, I fly over there. I mean, we were sitting on the floor half the time meditating, and this is the person that prescribes me meds, but she doesn't refer to me as someone with a disorder. She doesn't use words like comorbidity, which she know royally offends me, and just I don't feel good about myself. And so I think for us, when we talk about being trauma informed, it's recognizing that people have been trying to shove us into a round hole, and it's created a lot of problems. And what can we do to minimize that? What is language we can use? What are practices we can use that would not, continue that traumatic cycle?
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for explaining that. All right. So, uh, I think I'm just going to hit you with one more question today. and this is one that I've kind of been
Sure.
ending all these interviews with. If there is one thing you would want an audience that kind of knows less about neurodiversity to come away with today, what would that be?
I think I would want someone who's maybe heard the term, who has a general idea that maybe they associate it with autism, or maybe they know ADHD is in the mix. I would just want them to know that, um, you know, it's easy, it's much easier when people are different. It's much easier to look for the very reductionist way of thinking. Um, a lot of people, I mean, we're improving the awareness, but a lot of people still associate ADHD with little hyper boys.
Mm.
Um, that couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, there are plenty of adults, a good many, actually, and that still struggle. It's not something, despite the old, conventional wisdom. I mean, it's not something. I mean, I think that there's only something like maybe a third of people. Don't quote me on that. See Russ Barkley's book. He has the latest stats, but I feel like it's something like only a third of kiddos that are diagnosed with autism. It's not like they ever fully outgrow it. It's just they learn to manage it in such a way that they really no longer would meet necessarily, the criteria for having, impairment in their life. They still show symptoms, but the easy explanation for dismissing something like ADHD, and you hear it all the time, is you can take, the stance maybe like, well, we all have ADHD. I mean, come on, like how significant is that?
Yeah,
And
we're all
aside
a little
from the
autistic. We all a little OCD. Yeah, yeah.
right, right, right. And if you I would just challenge people who have heard these terms and they might be gravitating toward, simple explanations. I mean, aside from the fact that by definition, um, it's completely nonsensical to say we all have ADHD, because it wouldn't be a disorder if we all had ADHD. I mean, by definition, I mean, a disorder, we're talking about a smaller proportion of people. But I mean, aside from that, what it really does is what you're essentially saying to people that struggle with that is you're saying that it's all in your head, and that there's really no legitimacy to what you're claiming to live with. But it is something that has an enormous impact in people's lives. I mean, I live on SSDI. I mean, I was fortunate to obtain disability when I left academia years ago. I, if for your listeners who don't know much about the process of obtaining Social Security disability income, um, they don't they don't just give away that big lottery ticket to you very easily. They put you through the ringer. And so what I would encourage your listeners to do is every time they hear, something like we all have ADHD, or, they're joking around about someone who lives with OCD, or they might even be saying, and this is a pet peeve of mine, like, most certainly don't say you have something about, oh, that's my OCD, just because you like putting your pencil sharpener in the corner of your desk or something. It's like, by no means does that constitute, the real significant distress and issues that arise from that. So I would just say avoid the low-hanging fruit. Recognize that any monocausal theory of human behavior is going to be dead wrong, and just,
Mhm.
I would encourage your listeners to just be curious. Don't be judgmental. Don't go for the low-hanging fruit. Just be curious.
I think that's a wonderful thing to come away with. So this is from the Neurodiversity Network of West New York, located coming from Buffalo.
Mhm.
Yeah, Buffalo. So the website for that is going to be in the description. If you at home are thinking, wow, this really resonates with me, I want to get involved with this, please do. They have all kinds of events, both for people who are neurodiverse themselves, or for their children, or for neurotypical people who just, perhaps like yourself, believe in everything you just heard. So thank you so much, David, for joining me today. I really
Yeah,
enjoyed this interview.
yeah,
Um,
me too.
and I'm so
Yeah,
glad you could join us.
yeah, thanks. And yeah, just keep up the great work. I think this is a really great thing you're doing. And yeah, I mean, I think the more we know, the more we spread information and we think critically about these things, I think that puts us in a much more productive direction. So I tip my hat to you for the good
For
work
my
you're doing.
listeners, I got a real hat tip just there.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate
yeah,
it. I'll be sure to
yeah.
send you the finished product once I've, edited
Yeah,
it.
yeah, I'd love to hear it.
All
Yeah,
right. Thank you
it's
so
great.
much. That concludes this week's episode of Diverse. Make sure to join us next week when we'll hear from a writer and activist based in Connecticut who will help us address the intersectionality of race, queerness, and neurodiversity.